Good morning, Michael, and welcome to EY Citizen Today interview, where we're discussing the 100 Resilient Cities Network. And I'd be very keen for you just to give us a brief overview of the Resilient Cities Network and how it came about, and what sort of progress you're seeing so far.
So in 2013, the Rockefeller Foundation was celebrating its 100th anniversary, its centennial. And it looked around the world and it saw three major trends. It saw urbanization, globalization, and climate change. And urbanization is the rate at which people are moving into cities. For the first time this century, more than half of the world's population lives in cities, and by 2050, that's projected to be at 70%. And we see that in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, where people are moving in at a pace that infrastructure can't even keep up with. The second trend is globalization. What happens in one city now more and more affects what goes on in another. We see that in terms of flow of ideas and goods and services, diseases, as we saw in Ebola outbreak. Cities are more and more connected in a global way. And the third is climate change. Cities sit at some of the most vulnerable parts of the world to climate change, in river deltas, on coastlines, in high plains that are susceptible to rainfall changes. And so Rockefeller, to celebrate this centennial and to really address some of the key issues of the 21st century, announced its 100 Resilient Cities, its $100 million commitment to build urban resilience worldwide.
Right, fantastic. So I think you're glad it wasn't the millennium of the Rockefeller Foundation.
That's right. That's right.
A bit more of a challenge.
I mean, it's funny. The big joke was one of my colleagues said, "Why couldn't this have been the 50-year anniversary?" Because 50 would have been a much more manageable number. Yeah. No.
And your own, just briefly, your own background. Clearly, being investment banking, being an operational risk management, so risk management. Emergency management is sort of in your DNA. How have you found the transition from that investment banking background to basically a charitable foundation and working across 100 cities?
I think the foundation, under the leadership of President Judy Rodin, has tried to reshape itself to be much more active in the kinds of partners that it seeks out and much more dynamic in the way it works. So the idea of the old foundation, sort of plodding along, doing white paper studies and big research ideas. That's not the Rockefeller Foundation of today. You see, we're much keener to engage with dynamic corporate partners like EY and to work on some of the more topical issues in much more agile ways. And so for that reason, I think the transition from an investment bank like Deutsche Bank to the foundation felt very smooth and one that I could make.
Yeah. And you certainly see that for those of us that observe it from the outside, if you like, through your social media campaign that you have as 100RC, and also the website that you maintain. It really is best in class, and it really does take initiatives to a whole new level and engages sort of the sharing of knowledge, but also the opportunity for us to participate. So
maybe if I could just add on there, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's part of that's built around this idea that philanthropy can't solve the world's problems, right? In order, and just take an issue like urban resilience, in order for us to really address that, we need to bring in all the sectors. We need to bring in the private sector, civil society, the general public, as well as philanthropy and academia. And so this is a very conscious effort to try to create that community and to create those kind of partnerships that we can leverage to fix some of the world's really wicked problems.
Yeah, and for those of us that specialise in infrastructure, you really are the perfect example of a public-private partnership, because it's all about partnership at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And if we roll back 2-3 years ago when you put out your call for cities and you put out the call, did you really expect the avalanche that you received? Because I mean, it was quite amazing. I think it was over 1,000 applications you possibly got, and then you had the challenge of down selecting to 100. Has that surprised you in terms of the interest globally?
I think what surprised us was not the initial interest. So we put out our first call and we got about 350 applications, and that. In 2013, this was the big event in philanthropy, was this announcement by one of the world's grandest foundations. So that didn't surprise us. What we thought would happen is that there would be a waning of interest in this over the next years, and we were concerned. or we just didn't know, would we be able to get the same quality and number of applications across the geography? And what happened, which surprised us, is that we got 350 applications in the 2 following years.
Right.
And that's where you get that 1,000, 1,100 and some odd number. And so that really allowed us to be very selective. And what we were able to do actually over the years, we understood much better what made a good city, a good 100 RC city.
Right.
What cities were ripe for the change? We needed to have progressive leadership. We needed to have leadership that saw the interconnection of its challenges, whether it's infrastructure, or social, or stakeholder and leadership, that see the interconnection of those kind of challenges. And so we really sorted for those cities. For the cities that had the best mayors, the most progressive thinkers, the best stakeholders at the table, the ones that had these real meaningful challenges, but were in a position to address them. Right. And so that interest was not only nice to have from a profile perspective for the program, but it also allowed us to select cities that were more ready to act now,
right.
which is something that's
and
really
was that an evolution of thought process? So, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but was getting in as a Wave 3 city more difficult than getting in as a Wave 1?
It was definitely different, and I would say, one interesting thing is in Wave 1 we are still learning, and we're still learning, frankly, but we are learning in different ways. And in Wave 2 cities we got better at understanding, at describing what the opportunity was, around sorting the cities, around engaging with the cities, and Wave 3 were much more sophisticated. So, where we made some mistakes in some of our selections in Wave 1, I think Wave 2 and Wave 3 are much better prepared to act and move much quicker.
Right. And I know it's difficult to have a paternal instinct towards the 100 cities being your children, so to speak, but if you step back and look at some of the activity that's gone on amongst the cities to date, albeit, the Wave 1 cities are now just coming to issuing their resiliency plans. Is there anything you saw and you sat back and said, wow, we helped create that? Have you been impressed by the level of innovation that you've seen?
Yeah. I think there's been, yes, and we've seen it on a number of different levels. I think as someone who understands infrastructure, one of the things you'll know is that if we're going to really see infrastructure changing in profound ways in cities, that's something we won't see for another 5 years or more, right? So we're not having seen those kinds of changes yet. But I'll give you a few examples of early success, which gives us an idea that we're on the right path. So one is that we've seen cities win big competitive awards on the back of their strategies and the strength of their CROs. So we had the 3 big winners in the U.S., Norfolk, New Orleans, and New York, won a combined $450 million to support their projects in their strategies. And so that was a tremendous validation. In Norfolk, for example, the CRO came home with the single largest grant ever awarded to the city, $150 million. Right, so that's a great success. Another thing that we're seeing is other cities that aren't in the network copying the model, and so we've seen cities in California, the state of Virginia, the city of Virginia Beach, some cities in the New York area naming their own chief resilience officers and adopting this idea of holistic resilience. So the fact that it's spreading even without us having to do that, I think, is a second amazing success, and something that we're trying to build on, and something that we're measuring ourselves against, frankly. One third one is that we're seeing our partners collaborate in different ways, in really meaningful ways. So we just saw Swiss Re and Veolia, the French infrastructure giant and the Swiss reinsurer, on a different way to fund improvements in the New Orleans water system. And so that was a partnership that came directly out of this engagement. And so those are the kind of innovative solutions we're hoping to be able to bring to cities, not just in one city, but around the 100 cities network. And so for those reasons, I think we feel like we're on the right path.
No, certainly. And I think that point you make about 100 cities got selected and had the benefit of direct input from Rockefeller, but that ability of these 100 cities to help influence what's going over about, say, another 1,000 cities or whatever is fantastic. And I think the role that you've done to increase the profile of resiliency And I thought it was quite interesting. I think I did read somewhere that President Obama was almost putting his hand up to be the Chief Resiliency Officer for the US.
Yeah. So
you must be pleased at that. I mean, the acceptance you've got of the model as well on a universal basis.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting, like you wouldn't run a big financial services company or a big private sector company at all without a chief risk officer.
Yeah.
Someone at the very senior level who's thinking about how does each decision we make affect the risk profile of our company.
Yeah.
And yet, we don't have the similar kind of position until now in cities. And so having someone who carries those kinds of decisions and that viewpoint through every major decision, whether it's on infrastructure, it's programmatic, it's policy, through all of those decisions in a city, to carry those resilience, that resilience perspective, I think is something that's important. And one of the things that we've said about the goal is that the goal is not to change 100. The goal is to change every city
Yes.
around the world, depending on how you count
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
It could be 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, but it's a lot of cities.
Yeah.
And that you wouldn't run a city without a chief resilience officer any more than you would without a chief of police.
Right.
Like this becomes an indispensable
Mindset,
position.
yeah.
And so that's really the goal.
Yeah, the role of the Chief Resiliency Officer obviously is a pivotal role in the movement. Have you seen that role having to evolve as your thought process has evolved over the key objectives and perhaps some of the emerging challenges you have for the Resiliency Officer, and certainly in certain countries or governments where there might be multiple layers of government, their ability to not necessarily play the politics but perhaps manage the politics means that you need someone with a lot of different skills?
Yeah, I think that it definitely has evolved. And I think you're hitting on something, that a chief resilience officer has to be half political, because what we're talking about is we're talking about better health. You know, what is a resilient city? It's one that has good health and safety and public health. It has cohesive communities where neighbors check on neighbors. It has good infrastructure, both the built environment and the natural environment. It has strong and integrated leadership. All of those things help cities respond and recover from disasters and grow. And so a chief resilience officer has to play a little bit in all those spaces, but really all of those areas are owned by other owners.
Yeah.
Some of them are in government, some of them are in the private sector, some of them are in civil society.
And not even the mayor's as powerful as he thinks he is either.
Exactly. I mean, not even the mayor is as powerful. So the chief resilience officer has to be a political person to help, a connector, to connect the efforts of someone who's doing roads with someone who's doing drainage, with someone who's trying to build, you know, formal communities out of informal communities, right? That's the chief resilience officer's job. And yet, it can't just be a political animal. This chief resilience officer also has to have some technical skills. And so one of the things that's taken us, you know, we've spent a lot of time thinking about, and there's no clear right or wrong here, but what is the balance between the political skills and the technical skills? And it may be different for each city. There are some cities which technical, you know, I'm thinking about Northern Europe, for instance, in Netherlands, Denmark, in the United Kingdom, where technical goes a long way. You come in, you know your stuff, and you're able to put people together. There are other places, let's say Latin America, where it's a relationship.
Correct,
And so finding people who have those relationships, who know how to build those relationships, who can influence those relationships, that's the key of the chief resilience officer.
It comes complete with a cloak, I suspect, a Superman cloak. And I was quite encouraged by the sort of collaboration amongst the resiliency officers as well. I was fortunate enough to be at an event in Singapore where Lauren got the 12 Asia Pac or ASEAN ones together. And there does seem to be that there's no real competition. It is collaboration with the cities. So you must be so you actually get that economies of scale. And that's something certainly as a platform partner that we'd like to emulate. Because as you say, a lot of these cities do face similar challenges. So rather than try and repeat the solution, is there a way that we can actually take it across region? Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point about the value proposition of 100 resilient cities, is that we spend a lot of time and effort to try to organize cities in similar ways. Cities are diverse in many different ways. And you mentioned governance. Sometimes the mayors are very powerful, sometimes they're not powerful at all. Sometimes they operate in a state context or at a national context, and sometimes they're big, they're small. There are lots of different diversity in cities. And what we do is we spend time and effort trying to get cities to organize themselves around this concept of resilience and this position of a chief resilience officer. And we make them go through the similar strategy process. And at times it's painful because cities want to do things their own way. We've always done it this way because this is the way it works in Medellin or in Durban or in Singapore. And one of the ways that we've been able to get this collaboration going is to actually make them go through a similar process. And that allows them to really have apples to apples experiences to compare. And so when you get to an event like you're talking about in Singapore, where you get 12 CROs who have all gone through a similar process, all using the same terminology, all framing resilience in basically the same way with some small regional variations, that's really powerful. And so the network really starts to pop. And then to your point, one of the things we're trying to do is help platform partners like you get into cities with solutions that can change cities in more effective ways. If cities are all diverse and bespoke, it's much harder to enter that ecosystem. If they start to organize a little bit in similar ways, we can scale solutions and really start to move the needle and fix cities in powerful ways.
I think building on that theme that we just talked about, key stakeholders with mayors, chief resiliency officers, probably the potentially most important stakeholder will be the citizens. And it's questions we as EY just this week have launched some thought leadership on citizen engagement, and it's really how can you build a strong city pulse without first taking the human pulse. And it was quite an interesting piece of thought leadership we did, and it certainly shows that citizens are really more interested in the bottom-up type approach rather than traditional top-down. And is that something that you're seeing through your network, that the ability to engage more with citizens, and are the cities that are doing better the ones that have a stronger citizen engagement strategy?
I think just the act of engaging with citizens is resilience building in and of itself. Because you look at the most brittle cities, think about the Arab Spring cities. You had one fruit vendor in Tunis set himself on fire, and the whole region went up in smoke. And partly that was because many of those cities in those countries felt like two cities. You had the haves and the have-nots, and there wasn't a lot of engagement with the have-nots. And so the cities that actually engage their citizenry make themselves immune and resilient to, not immune might be too strong a word, but resilient to whatever happens, whether that's an earthquake, a hurricane, a law enforcement incident, and so that in and of itself is important. I would say what's really hard, and we push cities to do that kind of bottoms-up citizen engagement that you're talking about in different ways. But what's really hard is to close the loop. For a city to go back to its citizens and say, you said, we heard, we did. That loop closing is the thing where, like, it's easy to run. I've run now lots and different workshops, and we've sent out surveys, and there's online ways to engage, all kinds of different ways. We had a city in Greece, Thessaloniki, that actually put a resilience booth in the middle of its central square. And citizens could come up and play with some of the framework and say, oh, this is where the city's strong, this is where it's weak, this is what I want to see more. That's great. But how do we close the loop? And that's the thing that cities continue to struggle with, I think. And then
I suppose the follow-on to that is, how do you fund it? Is the other challenge. And clearly in the US you have the system where people can vote for infrastructure levies, but in other countries it's a bit more challenging. And I suppose that is one of the challenges down the track. And we as EY have actually been having preliminary discussions with IFC, another platform partner, looking at resiliency funding or bonds, etc. Because at the end of the day, unfortunately, someone's going to have to pay for this. But you might argue, and I would certainly argue, that you can't afford not to do it because the cost of it happening and not protecting yourself. But that is still a challenge, whether the citizens themselves see a value in that resiliency going forward. And again, it'll be interesting to see when these plans are released, looking back in maybe 5-10 years, to see, did the dollar investment flow through?
Yes. I think, so to take that last point first, that is definitely a metric that we're holding ourselves accountable for, and that we will track. Did the initiatives that were laid out actually materialize? How much investment did the strategies catalyze? Those are key metrics for us to know if we're actually doing anything in cities. I think that is certainly true. A second thing that I would say that what you said reminds me of is it's this getting cities to take a balanced approach between producing strategies that are doable and funded and those that are aspirational and not necessarily funded. Because we want, on one hand, we want the strategies to be catalysts for investment.
Yep.
We want mayors to put in big, important projects that they don't exactly know where they're going to get the funding for, but that are signals to the market and to national governments and to international structures like the IFC or the World Bank to say, this is where the direction we're going, this is what we want to do, help us come fund this. And on the same time, you can't have a plan that's just full of big ideas and things you can't fund. And so you need some things that are actually in there that are funded. So I think that's another kind of tension that we want our cities to struggle with.
And I think that's an ambitious goal as well. And because what we are seeing in the infrastructure market at the moment is there's no shortage of capital available to invest in infrastructure. But what the capital is looking for is robust and rigorous projects that make sense.
Yes.
And the beauty of the 100 Resilient Cities Network is that you're developing plans that have been through government, engaged with citizens, so the projects that come out at the end, whilst they might be ambitious projects, they're projects that make sense.
Yeah.
And they may well be the ones that, as you say, World Bank, other institutions feel that they are deserving of funding. And you may find that other private sector organisations, almost like a crowdfunding type initiative, people want to come and participate in these projects. And there could almost be that contagion effect where one of these projects may actually make another project alongside it that wasn't robust before. All of a sudden it has the economies of scale to make that project achievable.
Yeah.
So
I think there's so much in there that you've described very well. Part of what the value proposition is. Put out a plan that ties multiple initiatives together, that you can see the connection between things that were normally disconnected or unconnected. Even in a developed city like New York, you saw the connection between three ordinarily disparate initiatives. You had the mayor's housing plan to build more affordable housing. You had Vision Zero, which is a transportation plan, and you had economic development. And what the mayor put out in this strategy, the one NYC, is a goal that every New Yorker would live within 100,000 well-paying jobs. And so that started to get a multitude of different agencies thinking about how to solve that problem. The transportation people thought about it as a transportation problem. The housing people thought about it as housing. And economic development started to think about pushing economic development out of Midtown and downtown and into some of the outer boroughs so that it would make it closer. And all of that has an amazing resilience benefit. You start to diversify single points of failure in Manhattan. You start to build middle-class job base in different parts of the city. You start to get people out of their cars and off really long commutes and into more neighborhood economic development strategy. So it's all of those things together. And that only happens when you publish broad strategies that connect those kind of goals and initiatives.
And to my perspective, that's the whole essence of the 100 Resilient Cities Network that makes it so compelling, is that you're taking on social, economic, as well as physical challenges on a holistic approach. You're not trying to just segregate or silo, it's actually looking at it from a holistic perspective. And given the philanthropic goal at the beginning we talked about, the role of entrepreneurs in helping, have you seen much engagement from them? Clearly, as we move to this urbanization, smarter ways of doing things, smart ticketing, smart sort of systems, are you seeing a role for entrepreneurship in your program?
I think one is small and medium-sized enterprises and startups are key to resilient cities.
Yeah.
We've seen that. It's not just having large industry or a single sector, as we saw in Detroit, create the lack of fragility or the lack of resilience. That having a much more diverse ecosystem is important. So that's one thing. A second is, I think, like many people, we're seeing this rise of the sharing economy and the disaggregation of providers with services. And that's another piece that we think is a hallmark of resilient cities, where people share, whether that's lodging or transportation or other kinds of services. This sharing economy is another place where we see both entrepreneurs, to your point, but also a real important resilience aspect.
Yeah, and looking forward, so that's the Wave 3 cities were just announced back in May, so they've got another 18 months to go. Yeah. Where to beyond that for 100 resilient cities?
So one of the things that's become really clear to us, and I don't think I had this idea as clear when I started 3 years ago, but is the benefit and the value that we can add, not just in the planning process, but over the life cycle of implementation.
Yeah.
So you think about a project that has to get, first you have to scope it, and then you have to do cost benefit and environmental impact and all of the things, and then put a deal together and try to fund it and ultimately build it.
Yeah.
All of that, cities get stuck at different places along that way. And if we have the right partners, like you, who we can crowd in to help cities get over those different hurdles, whether it's funding or technical assistance or technology or political hurdles, frankly, if we can help, if we can stay connected with our cities throughout the implementation lifespan, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, then we can really help cities move the needle. And that's the goal.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we're thinking about that in two ways. One is a scale problem. If you think we have 100 cities, we've got, let's say 50 initiatives in each of the cities, that's 5,000 initiatives. How do you track those initiatives in a way that allows you to, come in and help and support where it's necessary? And you can't just do it at the initiative level. You got to do it down a level, so you understand really what are the places that cities are getting stuck on, and how can we bring the right partners to help them unstuck that. So that's one challenge we're wrestling with at an organizational level. The second is we're funded into 2020 to do this initial work with the 100. But how do we continue to be sustainable as an NGO, as a nonprofit? We could go back to Rockefeller for more funding. We could diversify our philanthropic base, or we could begin to think about how do we monetize some of the values and skills that we have. We'll have worked in 100 disparate, diverse cities around the world. We'll know mayors, we'll know key stakeholders, we'll understand the issues, we'll have great data about that. That may be something that can help us sustain ourselves so that we can be in existence. I think at the end will be a combination of all of those things. But our goal, and something that we're working on really intensely right now, is how do we not be around until 2020, but how do we be around until 2030 so we can help cities implement?
And I think the market would certainly welcome that, as you say, having you involved in the implementation. And as you surmise, I think a challenge for you will be, a good challenge, will be maintaining your independence, because I think that's something that having that independence of thought and not politically held, captured by someone, would give you that independence that you can actually move the agenda forward. Whereas if you were to be consumed potentially within an organization, within a government department or whatever, then you lose that kind of autonomy and freedom of movement.
I think that's true, and I think you're also pointing out risks to this. If we do monetize some of our services, and we're seen as trying to generate revenue as opposed to purely philanthropic and funded, we lose some of our leverage with the cities to be able to push mayors. One of the things we've been so impressed with personally is being able to stick our finger in the chest of mayors and say, I know you're thinking about it this way, but you need to think about it that way.
Yeah.
And mayors have been really responsive to that.
Yeah.
And I think, as we change this organization, some of that may end up changing. But it's a key risk that you point out, and one that we're cognizant of.
And clearly you've amassed a significant amount of talent as well within the organisation, so it would be good to keep that talent employed as you have been doing.
Yeah.
And just in terms of wrap up, like we at EY pride ourselves on being legacy builders. I'm not quite sure if it's too early for you to foreshadow, but if you had to foreshadow what the legacy for 100 Resilient Cities could be, what would you sort of say that would be?
Well, I think we want the urban resilience movement to flourish and to be something that we talk about in the same way we talk about sustainability or community policing or any of the big urban innovations of the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I think I think we could realistically say that started partly here.
Yeah.
And so that's a legacy.
Yes.
And we're concerned that movement doesn't die. We don't want this to be a flash in the pan, the latest buzzword, and for it to move on. I think given the multitude of challenges that the world's facing, that the world's cities are facing, they're going to need it.
Yeah.
And so the question is, how do we sustain that so we really improve people's lives?
Excellent. Well, that's a fantastic way to end. And we as EY certainly look very much forward to working with you in partnership. It certainly resonates very well with our strategic vision of building a better working world. And I think from an EY perspective is that we're quite fortunate that we have offices, and I think in almost all the 100 cities. I think our last count was 92 of the 100.
Really?
And
cool.
our staff, they love doing things associated with their city. So we have a lot of pent up support. And it's quite, every day I get an email from someone in our global network saying, can I work on this project? So we're very enthused, and we wish you all the best in your endeavours, and thank you very much for taking time.
Thanks for coming in.